In the unforgiving frontier of 1882, where mercy was rarer than gold and kindness could cost you your life, one cowboy's simple act of humanity would summon an army, not to destroy him, but to defend him. This is the true story of how a cup of water changed everything. Stay with us as we uncover how one moment of compassion transformed a drifter into a legend, and discover the ancient code of honor that still echoes through the canyons of Arizona today. Like and subscribe to witness stories where humanity triumphs against all odds. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, turning the desert into a furnace that could kill a man in hours. Jake Morrison pulled his hat lower, squinting against the glare as his horse picked its way carefully through the rocky terrain. At 35, Jake had spent half his life drifting from ranch to ranch, carrying nothing but his bedroll, a worn Colt. 45, and the bitter taste of a war that had ended 15 years ago, but still haunted his dreams. The sound reached him first, voices raised in anger, the sharp crack of a rifle. Jake reined in his horse, listening. In country like this, gunfire usually meant trouble, and trouble meant decent folks might need help. Despite his better judgment, Jake urged his mount toward the commotion. What he found made his blood run cold. 3 men stood in a semicircle around a figure crumpled on the ground. Bounty hunters by the look of them, dirty, unshaven, with the cold eyes of men who killed for money. Their leader, a scarred man with a tobacco-stained beard, held a smoking rifle. "Should have stayed on the reservation, girl," the man was saying. "Now you're going to learn what happens to Apache who steal from white folks." Jake's horse shifted, and one of the hunters spun around, drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. "Well, well, got ourselves a witness, boys." "Easy there," Jake said, raising his hands slowly. "Just passing through." The leader laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "Name's Briggs. These here are my associates, Wilson and Creek. We're tracking this little Apache thief. She stole a horse from the Murphy Ranch 3 days back." Jake looked down at the figure on the ground. She couldn't be more than 16, wearing a torn dress that had once been blue. Blood seeped from a wound in her shoulder, and her dark eyes burned with pain and defiance. Despite her injuries, she sat straight, chin raised, facing her tormentors without flinching. "Don't look much like a horse thief to me," Jake said quietly. Briggs's eyes narrowed. "You calling me a liar, Drifter?" "Just making an observation." Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Girls hurt bad. Mind if I take a look?" "I mind plenty," Wilson snarled, a thin man with nervous hands that kept twitching toward his gun. "This ain't your concern." But Jake was already moving, pulling his canteen from his saddle. The girl watched him approach, confusion flickering across her features. In her world, white men brought only death and sorrow, yet something in this stranger's eyes was different. Tired, yes, but not cruel. "Don't you move another step," Briggs commanded, raising his rifle. Jake stopped, looked back at the bounty hunters, then at the girl. Her lips were cracked, her skin paled from blood loss. She needed water, medical attention, and most of all, she needed someone to show her that not every white man was a monster. "She's dying," Jake said simply. "Good," Creek muttered, the youngest of the 3 but with eyes already dead to mercy. "Save us the trouble of dragging her back to Fort Apache." Jake made his choice. Ignoring the guns trained on him, he knelt beside the girl and uncorked his canteen. "Easy now," he whispered, supporting her head gently. "Just a little water." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face. Then, slowly, she allowed him to tip the canteen to her lips. The water ran down her chin, but she managed several swallows, her eyes never leaving his. "You're making a big mistake, Cowboy," Briggs warned, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jake looked up, still supporting the girl. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." What none of them noticed was the figure watching from the rocky outcropping above, an old Apache warrior whose weathered face reflected a lifetime of battles, betrayals, and broken promises. Chief Running Bear had been tracking the bounty hunters for 2 days, waiting for the right moment to rescue his granddaughter. Now he witnessed something that shook him to his core, a white man risking his life to show kindness to an Apache child. The girl, Ayana, whose name meant Eternal Blossom, whispered something in Apache, her voice barely audible. "What did she say?" Jake asked, though he knew none of them spoke the language. From his hiding place, Running Bear understood. His granddaughter had said, Why does he help me? It was a question that would echo through the desert wind and change everything. Briggs chambered another round. Step away from the girl, Drifter. This is your last warning. Jake helped Ayana drink again, then gently laid her head back down. He stood slowly, his hand resting on his gun butt. I reckon if you wanted to shoot me, you'd have done it already. Don't test me, Briggs snarled. But something had shifted. Jake's simple act of compassion had created an unexpected dynamic. The bounty hunters were brutal men, but they weren't complete monsters. At least not all of them. Wilson's hand had stopped twitching. Creek looked uncomfortable. Even Briggs seemed less certain. She stole a horse, Briggs said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Did she? Jake asked quietly. Or did she just need to get away from something worse? Above them, Running Bear had seen enough. His granddaughter had fled the reservation after soldiers had tried to force themselves on her. She'd taken a horse to escape, yes, but it was hardly theft when weighed against what had driven her to run. The old chief began to withdraw, but not before making a decision that would bind his people to this strange white man. A debt of honor had been created, one that Apache law demanded be repaid. As the sun climbed higher, Jake found himself in an impossible situation. 3 guns pointed at him, a dying girl at his feet, and a choice that would define not just this moment, but the rest of his life. He knelt again, offering Ayana more water, and whispered words that would be remembered long after the desert claimed them all. You're safe now, little sister. I won't let them hurt you. In the rocks above, Running Bear smiled grimly. This white man had just sealed his fate, though whether for good or ill remained to be seen. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Jake remained crouched beside Ayana, one hand steadying the canteen, the other hovering near his colt. The girl's breathing had grown more labored, and the bloodstain on her shoulder was spreading. Time's up, Drifter, Briggs growled, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Something about Jake's calm demeanor unsettled him. Most men would be begging by now, or reaching for their guns in panic. This one just kept giving water to a dying Apache girl like he had all the time in the world. She needs a doctor, Jake said without looking up. There's a trading post about 10 miles south. Old Doc Henderson runs a clinic there. Wilson laughed nervously. You think we're gonna let you waltz out of here with our bounty? What bounty? Jake asked, finally standing. Look at her, Wilson. She's barely alive. What's the reward on a dead Apache girl worth? $20, $30? Creek spat in the dust. Money's money. Is it worth dying for? Jake's voice was soft, conversational, but his meaning was clear. Because that's what this is coming to. You boys know who I am? Briggs frowned. There was something familiar about the stranger. The way he moved, the quiet confidence in his voice. Should we? Jake Morrison. Some folks call me the Abilene Kid. The name hit like a thunderclap. Every man on the frontier had heard the stories. The fastest gun in Kansas. The cowboy who'd faced down 6 rustlers single-handed. The soldier who'd survived Antietam and Gettysburg, only to become a legend in the cattle towns. Wilson's hand trembled as he gripped his pistol. You're lying. Jake shrugged. Check my left shoulder. Confederate grape shot, 1863. Or maybe you'd prefer to see how fast I can clear leather. The Abilene Kid died years ago, Briggs said, but doubt crept into his voice. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. Jake's eyes never wavered from the 3 men. Now, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to pick up this girl, put her on my horse, and ride to Doc Henderson's. Anyone who tries to stop me won't live to regret it. From his vantage point, Running Bear watched the confrontation unfold with growing amazement. He'd fought white soldiers for 40 years, had seen their cruelty firsthand. But this man, this Jake Morrison, was different. He spoke of violence with the casual authority of someone who'd danced with death many times, yet he wielded that threat only to protect the helpless. Creek's nerve broke first. I ain't dying for $30, he muttered, holstering his gun. Creek, you yellow, Briggs started. Shut up, Briggs, Wilson interrupted, his own weapon wavering. If that's really the Abilene Kid, we're outgunned and outclassed. But Briggs was beyond reason now, driven by greed and wounded pride. I don't care if he's Wild Bill Hickok himself. Nobody makes a fool of Sam Briggs. He swung his rifle toward Jake, finger tightening on the trigger. In that instant, several things happened at once. Jake's hand moved like lightning, his Colt clearing the holster in a blur of motion. The shot echoed across the desert, but it wasn't Jake's gun that fired. An arrow sprouted from Briggs's chest, the impact spinning him around. He looked down at the feathered shaft in bewilderment, then toppled forward into the dust. Wilson and Creek spun wildly, searching for the archer, but the rocks revealed nothing. Another arrow whistled past Wilson's ear, close enough to part his hair. The message was clear. "Jesus Christ," Creek whispered. "Apaches? How many?" Wilson asked, his voice cracking. Jake hadn't moved from beside Ayanna, but his gun remained drawn. "Hard to say, could be 1, could be 50. Apache are funny that way. You never see them until they want you to." A voice echoed from the rocks, speaking in heavily accented English. "White men go, leave girl, live to see sunset." Creek needed no further encouragement. He ran for his horse, Wilson, close behind. They spurred their mounts into a gallop, dust clouds marking their hasty retreat. Jake waited until the hoofbeats faded, then slowly holstered his weapon. "I know you're up there," he called to the rocks. "Thank you." Silence stretched between the stone formations and the desert floor. Then, gradually, a figure emerged from the shadows. An old Apache warrior, weathered as the mountains themselves, with silver hair braided with eagle feathers. His dark eyes held the weight of decades, and in his weathered hands was a bow that had ended many lives. Jake recognized the man's bearing immediately. This was no ordinary warrior. This was a chief, and by the careful way he moved, one who'd survived more battles than most men could imagine. Running Bear approached slowly, his gaze moving between Jake and his granddaughter. When he reached them, he knelt beside Ayanna, speaking softly in Apache. She responded weakly, gesturing toward Jake. The old chief looked up, studying Jake's face with the intensity of a man who'd learned to read character in a glance. What he saw there, the genuine concern, the absence of fear or hatred, confirmed what his granddaughter had told him. "She says you gave her water," Running Bear said in careful English. "Yes? Why?" Jake considered the question, then gave the only answer that made sense. "Because she needed it." Running Bear was quiet for a long moment. In Apache culture, kindness to a stranger created bonds that transcended tribal boundaries. This white man had risked his life for Ayanna, not for gold, not for glory, but simply because it was right. "What is your name?" the chief asked. "Jake Morrison. I am Running Bear. This is my granddaughter, Ayanna." The old man's voice carried the authority of command, but also something else, respect. "You have shown honor today, Jake Morrison. This will not be forgotten." Jake nodded toward Ayanna, who was watching the exchange with growing awareness. "She needs medical attention. There's a doctor." "I know of this doctor," Running Bear interrupted. "He has treated my people before. But first, I must ask, what do you want in return for your kindness?" "Nothing," Jake said simply. The answer seemed to surprise the chief. In his experience, white men always wanted something: land, gold, advantage. The concept of selfless compassion was foreign to the world he'd inhabited for 70 years. "All men want something," Running Bear insisted. Jake looked down at Ayanna, then back at the old warrior. "Maybe just to know she'll be all right." Running Bear studied him for another long moment, then made a decision that would echo through both their lives. He reached into his shirt and withdrew a small pouch made of deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork. "Apache law says a life debt must be repaid," he said, offering the pouch to Jake. "This contains sacred earth from our ancestral lands. While you carry it, you are under the protection of the Eagle clan." Jake hesitated. "I don't understand." "Someday you will." Running Bear helped his granddaughter to her feet, supporting her weight. "The desert remembers kindness, Jake Morrison. It also remembers those who show it." As the old chief and his granddaughter disappeared into the rocky maze from which they'd emerged, Jake was left alone with Briggs' body and more questions than answers. He looked down at the small pouch in his hand, feeling the weight of something far heavier than sacred earth. He had no way of knowing that Running Bear had just set in motion events that would transform his life forever. The Apache chief had witnessed something that challenged everything he'd believed about white men, and Apache law was very specific about life debts. What Jake Morrison had started with a simple cup of water was about to become legend. 3 weeks later, Jake was 40 miles south, working a small spread he'd decided to call home. The land was rough, rocky soil, sparse grass, and water that had to be coaxed from a reluctant well. But it was his, bought with the last of his army pay and the proceeds from selling his gun to lesser men who thought they needed his reputation more than he did. The cabin was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it kept the wind out. Jake had spent years sleeping under stars. Having a door to close felt like luxury. He'd even started talking about getting some cattle, maybe building a proper ranch. For the first time since the war, he was thinking about the future instead of just surviving the present. That morning he was repairing fence posts when he heard them coming. The thunder started as a distant rumble, like a storm approaching across the desert. But the sky was clear and the sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. Jake straightened, shading his eyes against the early sun, and felt his blood turn cold. Riders. A lot of them. He counted 20, then 50, then stopped counting. They came in a long column, moving with the fluid precision of men who'd ridden together for years. As they drew closer, Jake could make out details that made his mouth go dry. War paint, eagle feathers, and enough weapons to outfit a small army. Apache warriors, more than he'd ever seen in one place. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. Even the Abilene kid couldn't face odds like these. If they'd come to kill him, he was already dead. If they'd come for something else, well, he'd find out soon enough. The column halted 100 yards from his cabin, close enough that he could see individual faces, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. It was a courtesy he hadn't expected, and one that probably meant he'd live long enough to hear what they wanted. A single rider approached, Running Bear, looking exactly as Jake remembered him, except for the ceremonial war bonnet that marked him as a chief of significant standing. Behind him rode Ayanna, fully recovered and sitting her horse with the natural grace of someone born to the saddle. "Jake Morrison," Running Bear called out in English. "We meet again." "Chief Running Bear." Jake nodded respectfully. "Good to see your granddaughter looking well." Ayanna urged her horse forward, stopping close enough that Jake could see the intelligence burning in her dark eyes. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear. "I told my grandfather what you did. How you gave me water when the bad men would have killed you for it. Any decent person would have done the same," Jake replied. "No," Running Bear corrected, his voice carrying across the desert air. "Most would not. We have tested this." Jake frowned. "Tested it how?" "For 3 weeks my warriors have watched white settlements. They have seen white men pass by wounded Apache without stopping. They have seen them laugh at our suffering, spit on our children, turn away from our dying." The old chief's voice hardened. "You are the only one who chose differently." The weight of that statement settled on Jake like a physical burden. He thought of all the times he'd seen injustice and looked away, all the moments when he'd chosen safety over compassion. What had made that day different? Why had he risked everything for one Apache girl? "I don't understand why you're here," Jake said finally. Running Bear dismounted and approached on foot, a gesture of respect that was not lost on Jake. "Apache law is clear. A life debt must be repaid. You saved my granddaughter. Not just her body, but her spirit. She had begun to believe that all white men were monsters. You showed her that some carry light instead of darkness. It was just water. It was everything." The chief's interruption was gentle but firm. "In our tradition, when someone saves a member of the Eagle clan, they become family. The debt passes to the entire tribe." Jake looked past Running Bear at the assembled warriors. Dozens of fierce fighters who could have wiped his homestead off the map without breaking stride. Instead, they sat their horses in respectful silence, waiting for their chief to complete whatever ceremony had brought them here. "What does that mean?" Jake asked. Running Bear smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "It means you are no longer alone in this desert, Jake Morrison. It means that as long as the eagle flies and the wind blows, the Eagle clan will consider you family." Ayanna rode closer, her own expression solemn. "My grandfather has declared you adopted into our tribe. The warriors behind him have sworn to protect your land, your family, your honor. It is a bond that cannot be broken." Jake stared at her, then at Running Bear, struggling to process what he was hearing. "But I'm not Apache. I don't know your ways, your customs. You know the most important one," Running Bear interrupted. "You know that water shared in the desert creates bonds stronger than blood. You know that kindness to strangers is the mark of a true warrior. Everything else can be learned." The old chief reached into his saddlebags and withdrew something that made Jake's breath catch. A war lance decorated with eagle feathers and bearing the symbols of the Eagle clan. It was clearly old, clearly precious, and clearly meant for him. "This belonged to my father and his father before him," Running Bear explained. "It has never been carried by a white man. Today, that changes." He offered the lance to Jake, who hesitated. "I can't accept this, it's too much." "Apache law does not recognize too much when it comes to life debts," Ayana said softly. "You gave water when you could have stayed silent. You risked death when you could have ridden away. The debt is beyond measure, so the payment must be as well." Jake took the lance, feeling the smooth wood worn by generations of Apache hands. The weight of it was incredible, not just the physical heft, but the history, the honor, the responsibility it represented. "There is more," Running Bear continued. "From this day forward, 300 warriors of the Eagle clan will consider your land sacred ground. Any who would harm you or yours will face the full wrath of the Apache nation." The magnitude of what was being offered struck Jake like a physical blow. 300 warriors, more protection than any man on the frontier could dream of, all because he'd given water to a dying girl. "Why?" he whispered. Running Bear's answer was simple. "Because you saw her as human when others saw only an enemy. Because you chose compassion when survival demanded cruelty. Because in you, we glimpsed what this land could be if more men carried water instead of only guns." Behind the chief, the assembled warriors began a low chant, their voices rising and falling like the wind through canyon walls. It was a song of adoption, of welcome, of bonds forged in blood and honored in spirit. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison found himself transformed from a lonely drifter into something he'd never imagined. A man with family, with purpose, with a place to call home. But the greatest change was yet to come, and it would test every bond that had been forged in the desert heat. 2 months after the Apache adoption ceremony, Jake's life had settled into a routine that still amazed him. True to their word, Running Bear's warriors maintained a protective watch over his land, though they did so with such skill that most visitors never knew they were there. Jake's small ranch began to prosper. As word spread that he was under Apache protection, rustlers and claim jumpers gave his spread a wide berth, and honest neighbors felt safer knowing the Eagle clan watched over the area. But peace in the Arizona territory was always fragile, and Jake should have known it couldn't last. The trouble came with the morning mail, delivered by a nervous rider who kept glancing at the rocks as if expecting arrows to start flying. The letter bore an official seal that made Jake's stomach clench, the territorial governor's officer. "Mr. Morrison," the letter began, "your recent associations with hostile Apache elements have come to our attention. You are hereby ordered to appear before a territorial tribunal to answer charges of aiding and abetting enemies of the United States. Failure to appear will result in the immediate seizure of your property and your arrest as a traitor to the territory of Arizona. Governor Samuel Whitman." Jake read the letter twice, then walked to his fence line where he could see the desert stretching toward the Apache strongholds. As if summoned by his thoughts, a rider appeared on the horizon. Ayana, moving at a gallop that spoke of urgent news. She reined in beside him, her horse lathered with sweat. "Soldiers," she gasped. "A full company, maybe more. They're making camp 10 miles north." "How many?" "Grandfather counts over 200. They have cannons, Jake. And they're flying a black flag." Jake's blood turned cold. A black flag meant no quarter, no prisoners, no negotiations, no mercy. The territorial government had decided to make an example, and Jake Morrison was apparently going to be the lesson. "You have to run," Ayana continued urgently. "Take your horse and ride south. Cross into Mexico. Grandfather says the clan will help you disappear." Jake looked at the letter in his hand, then at his small cabin, the fence posts he'd set with his own hands, the well he'd dug through solid rock. For the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for. "No," he said quietly. "Jake, you don't understand. Governor Whitman wants you dead. This tribunal is just an excuse to—" "I understand perfectly." Jake folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt. "But I'm not running. Not from this." What neither of them noticed was the figure watching from a nearby rise, Running Bear, who had been tracking the approaching soldiers for hours. The old chief had seen territorial justice before. It usually involved a quick trial, followed by a quicker hanging. As the afternoon wore on, Jake prepared for what might be his last evening on Earth. He cleaned his guns, wrote letters he hoped someone would find, and tried to make peace with a decision that probably meant his death. The soldiers arrived at sunset, their brass buttons gleaming in the dying light. They came in force, 200 blue-coated cavalrymen led by a colonel whose reputation for dealing with Indian sympathizers was legendary. Colonel Marcus Brennan was a Civil War veteran who believed the only good Apache was a dead Apache, and anyone who thought differently was a traitor worthy of a similar fate. "Jake Morrison," Brennan called out, his voice carrying the absolute authority of federal might. "By order of the territorial government, you are under arrest for treason, sedition, and providing aid and comfort to enemies of the United States." Jake stepped out of his cabin, his hands visible, but his gun still on his hip. "I'm here, Colonel. Though I'd like to know exactly what I'm accused of." Brennan's smile was cold as winter wind. "Witnesses report that you've been harboring Apache warriors, providing them with information about troop movements, and actively collaborating with known hostiles." "That's a lie," Jake said flatly. "Is it? Then explain why Apache warriors have been seen on your land." "Maybe because this is Arizona territory, Colonel. Apache have been here for 1,000 years. The colonel's expression hardened. "Don't get clever with me, boy. We know about your adoption into their tribe. We know about the war lance you carry. And we know that you've been meeting regularly with Running Bear and his war party." Jake felt the noose tightening, but he kept his voice level. "Last I checked, being adopted by Indians wasn't a capital crime. It is when those Indians are at war with the United States." Brennan gestured to his men who raised their rifles. "You have 30 seconds to surrender your weapons and submit to arrest. After that, we'll consider you a hostile and act accordingly." It was then that the miracle happened. A sound began in the distance, low, rhythmic, growing stronger. At first it seemed like wind through the canyons. Then it resolved into what it truly was. The war chant of 300 Apache warriors. They appeared as if conjured from the desert itself, emerging from gullies and rocks and shadows where no man should have been able to hide. They came on foot and on horseback, painted for war, armed with everything from traditional bows to modern rifles. At their head rode Running Bear, wearing full ceremonial regalia and carrying the war lance of his grandfather. But they didn't attack. Instead, they formed a vast circle around Jake's homestead, surrounding the soldiers completely. The message was clear. To reach Jake Morrison, the cavalry would have to go through every warrior of the Eagle clan. Colonel Brennan stared at the encircling Apache with obvious shock. His intelligence had suggested a small band of renegades, not a full tribal war party. His 200 soldiers suddenly seemed very small indeed. "This changes nothing," Brennan shouted, though his voice cracked slightly. "Morrison is still under arrest." Running Bear urged his horse forward, stopping just outside rifle range. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the desert air. "The man you call Morrison is Eagle Clan. He is our son, our brother, our blood. Apache law protects him." "Apache law means nothing here," Brennan retorted. "This is United States territory." "This is Apache land," Running Bear corrected calmly. "Your papers say otherwise, but the earth remembers who nurtured it for 1,000 generations." The standoff stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. 300 warriors faced 200 soldiers across a piece of ground that had become the center of two very different concepts of justice. It was Jake who broke the silence. "Colonel," he called out, stepping forward, "you want to arrest me for helping Apache? Then arrest me. But these warriors didn't come here to fight your soldiers. They came here to honor a debt. The only blood that needs to be spilled today is mine." Running Bear's voice cut through the desert air like a blade. "No. The Eagle Clan has spoken. You are family. We do not abandon family." What happened next would be talked about around campfires and in barrooms for generations. Colonel Brennan, faced with a choice between federal authority and practical survival, made a decision that probably saved 200 lives. "Stand down," he ordered his men. Then to Jake, "Morrison, you have 24 hours to leave the territory. If I see you in Arizona after tomorrow's sunset, I'll hunt you down myself." But Jake shook his head. "I'm not leaving, Colonel. This is my home." "Then you're a dead man." "Maybe, but I'll die on my own land, surrounded by family. The colonel studied Jake for a long moment, perhaps seeing something that reminded him of his own youth, his own code of honor. Finally, he turned to his men. "Mount up. We're returning to the fort." "Sir?" his lieutenant asked, confused. "You heard me. Mount up." As the soldiers prepared to leave, Brennan rode close to Jake. "This isn't over, Morrison. Whitman won't forget this." "Neither will I, Colonel." But as the cavalry disappeared into the gathering darkness, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed. The standoff had been about more than one man's fate. It had been about whether compassion and honor still mattered in a world increasingly driven by politics and prejudice. The Apache warriors began to disperse as quietly as they'd arrived, but Running Bear remained. He dismounted and approached Jake, his weathered face reflecting the firelight from the cabin. "You chose to stay," the old chief observed. "This is my home," Jake replied. "These are my people." Running Bear smiled, and in that smile was the warmth of a father proud of his son. "The debt is repaid, Jake Morrison, but the bond remains. Always." As the Apache chief rode away into the star-filled night, Jake stood alone on his land, but not truly alone. He carried with him the knowledge that kindness, once offered freely, creates connections that transcend race, culture, and even the laws of men. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the desert wind carried the echo across miles of open country, where 300 warriors continued their silent watch over a cowboy who'd learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the fastest gun, but from the willingness to offer water to a stranger in need. The story of Jake Morrison and the Eagle Clan would be told for generations, a reminder that in the hardest of lands, among the hardest of people, humanity could still triumph over hatred, and that sometimes a single cup of water could change the world.